Stroll down King Street, Alexandria on any given day, and you'll find no shortage of newspaper and circular boxes. However, at the intersection of King and Union Street is a lone newspaper box with a dented side and clouded over cover. This box is for the Alexandria Gazette packet. The Alexandria Gazette is an unassuming small paper that averages about 15 pages per issue and costs 25 cents. You wouldn't guess, judged on the state of this newspaper box, that this paper has survived centuries of American history. Alexandria's history of printing dates to 1784. The city's first printing plant belonged to George Richards and Company, and it stood at the intersection of Princess and Fairfax Street. The title of that first paper was the Virginia Journal and Alexandria Observer. The present-day Alexandria Gazette can trace its origins to this first paper. Samuel Snowden moved to Alexandria from New Jersey in the year 1800. It was that year he also decided to start a paper. Though he had a number of collaborators that dropped in and out over the years, he is largely credited for founding the Gazette. The paper underwent a series of name changes from 1800 to 1824. The Alexandria Daily Advertiser from 1803 to 1808. The Alexandria Daily Gazette, Commercial and Political, 1808 to 1812. Alexandria Gazette, Commercial and Political, 1812 to 1817. Alexandria Gazette and Daily Advertiser, 1817 to 1819. Gazette and Daily Advertiser, 1819 to 1821. Alexandria Gazette and Daily Advertiser, 1821 to 1822. Alexandria Gazette and Advertiser, 1822 to 1824. And the Alexandria Phoenix Gazette, 1825 to 1833. At some point between 1833 and 1834, the Phoenix portion of the name was dropped. Snowden continued to run the Gazette until his death in 1831. Snowden's 21-year-old son, Edgar Snowden, resumed ownership of the paper. In 1860, the United States was on the brink of war. Lincoln was elected president in November. Not long after his inauguration in March 1861, the Civil War began with the firing of Fort Sumter on April 12. A little over a month later, on May 23rd, Virginia seceded from the Union. On the morning of May 24th, Union soldiers marched to Alexandria from Washington, D.C. and occupied the city. At the time of the Union occupation, there were only two papers, the Virginia Sentinel and the Gazette. It's unclear whether the editors of the Sentinel disbanded or fled once the Union soldiers marched into the city, but once that paper was gone, the Gazette was the only remaining paper in Alexandria. Under Union occupation, the Gazette did not thrive. By the summer of 1861, the paper had disappeared. However, that fall, Edgar Jr. began a small paper called the Local News. It was a small, quote, non-committal sheet with almost no editorials, unquote. Overall, it had varied content. News stories, advertising, current events. It could even report on the crimes of Union soldiers, such as fights and break-ins. The Local News ran smoothly and without incident until February 1862. On Sunday, February 9th, 1862, a violent and alarming event occurred that made Snowden completely abandon the rule of no editorials. St. Paul's Episcopal Church, founded in 1808 and currently at 228 South Pitt Street, was the site of a disturbance between Union soldiers and Alexandrians. The Reverend K.J. Stewart conducted Sunday services at the church, and at the services on February 9th, he began to read the litany. However, several Union soldiers in the congregation, including Captain Elon Farnsworth, noticed that the Reverend did not recite the prayer for the President of the United States. The soldiers demanded that he read the prayer, but he ignored them. Farnsworth then decided to arrest the Reverend, so the prayer book was taken from Mr. Stewart's hand. He was seized and conducted out of the church, followed by his little daughter who clung to her father and was held by one of the soldiers. Great excitement ensued. so much that firearms were drawn, a lady in the choir gallery threw a book at a Union soldier, and, quote, a warning was issued to females and others, threatening arrest for offensive remarks in demonstrations, unquote. The minister was eventually released. The next day, the local news issued a scathing editorial regarding the events in the church the day before. The editorial describes the event as never having, quote, a parallel among civilized nations, certainly not in the history of this country, unquote. Farnsworth called the Reverend a rebel and a traitor. The editorial continues to deplore the actions of the Union soldiers and ends, quote, it will, however, be well to state that Mr. Stewart only insists upon the right of all ambassadors to communicate with their king, untrammeled by civil or military interference, unquote. Though the event ended peacefully, the Union unrest was far from over. That evening, the offices of the Alexandria Gazette caught fire and burned. How the fire began remains unknown. Several sources called the fire mysterious, but others claim that the fire was started by Union soldiers as retaliation for the editorial. Regardless of origin, the scars from the fire remain on the side of the building to this day, a testament to the historical event that occurred on this spot. On May 13, 1862, Edgar Snowden Jr. revived the Gazette from the ashes. The paper's offices were moved to 104 King Street over a bookstore. The May 13th edition of the paper states it as, quote, a continuation of domestic annals commenced by the Alexandria Gazette in 1799 and, together with the sheets of the local news, completes the connection between 62nd and 63rd volumes of the Gazette. The first item listed is the fire on February 10th. The Alexandria Gazette office burned and further issue of the local news suspended. In the opposite column, in a brief yet somehow triumphant fashion, the last item reads, May 13th, Alexandria Gazette resumed. And resume it did. At the top of the current edition of the paper, in 2020, is a brief yet powerful tagline, serving Alexandria for over 200 years.